At first, I thought that author Thomas was just a big fan of opening a comic book with a flashback sequence. We had one at the start of issue 1, another at the start of issue 3, and look at this, we have another one with issue 5. This time, though, we're with young Curtis Metcalf as he watches his father leave. Even when he was a child, Curtis could feel when it started happening, when his dad leaving began. There's just a gap there. His dad said all the right things, assured Curtis that it wasn't his fault, that he loved him, that sometimes, people just grow apart. And that is true, but that doesn't mean that it didn't hurt either. Curtis describes it like dying. It feels a lot like right now, actually. That's what's running through the mind of Hardware, his arms spread out wide and his back bent over. A red force field holds up the Sim Science building, preventing it from collapsing on top of Asher Sim. The missiles that Edwin Alva had sent, thanks to his military contacts, weren't diverted or stopped between issues. They impacted, and now Curtis and Asher stand beneath a collapsing building. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown episode 22.5, Self-Made Men. Smash cut to Tiffany Evans, Baraki Young, and their single surviving bodyguard at Medina University. They are running down a hallway, pursued by an army of the same man. Like, imagine a dude in a yellow jumpsuit with goggles and a blonde pompadour-style looking hairdo, but there are like 50 exact copies of him running down the hallway. And then you've got our bad guy. He also graces the cover of this issue. And to be quite honest, he seems a little silly to me. Anyways, Baraki tells Tiffany and the bodyguard, who is named Draymond, to go through this door. Only faculty have access, and she'll change the code once they're through. Tiffany is reluctant to leave her behind, but Baraki is adamant. Alva is after Tiffany, not her. She needs to get out of here. Draymond and Tiffany do keep moving, leaving Baraki standing tall as the multiple man approaches. "Look at you, Professor," he says. "All is lost, and you're not even scared." She scoffs. "You're a needy white man that makes more needy white men." Yeah, I've seen that before. "Somebody get this man some burn ointment because floop, that hurts!" In Singapore, Hardware systems struggle to maintain their energy output on that force field. He shouts Asher awake. Either the man passed out or the pressure wave knocked him out, I guess. Asher freaks out for a moment and does a powerful, stress-relieving scream. Water is slowly filling the room, by the way. Hardware stares at Asher. "You done?" And unfortunately, no, Asher is still panicking. They're gonna die. Why would Alva do this? What can they do? Hardware says that he has a plan. They're gonna need to build something. He just needs Asher to calm down and listen to him. We cut away for a moment to Tiffany and Draymond, allowing Hardware to tell Asher his plan without also telling us that plan. Thomas does this to increase the tension of the scene. It is a classic comic book technique. Nothing of real note happens in the Tiffany scene, I'm afraid to say, other than confirming that she appears to have safely escaped pursuit. Asher, when we return to them, has plugged a tablet into Hardware's armor. He's then shown with some kind of gun or blaster or maybe like a power tool, maybe like a rivet gun. Asher assures Curtis that if they live through this, then he will help him. He will give him everything that he needs to take down Alva. Right now, though, Curtis's only thoughts are on surviving this moment. Sim throws himself into the water. He appears to smack the floor, and nothing happens, which isn't surprising. We are shown the water level rising up to Hardware's neck now. Asher surfaces, says that there's no time. The water is up to Hardware's brow. Asher tries again, and this time the floor gives way. Water dumps out into the sub-basement, taking Asher and Hardware with it. Curtis grabs Asher from the current, and they rocket off to safety. Later, the pair watch Sim Science burn. Asher meant what he said inside. There's a private jet waiting for Curtis at the airport. It'll have him back at Dakota by tomorrow. Asher will have sent him all the information that he needs to finish off Alva. He's just sorry that he didn't do it sooner. Hardware isn't quite ready to believe him yet. He's starting to think that maybe they're all a bit too much alike, him, Asher, and Alva. Curtis tells Pop to scan the skies while they're traveling to find GPS locations for Baraki and Tiffany. We then transition to Tiffany, and that is a nice scene transition. Thank you for not just doing another smash cut. Tiffany is at an undisclosed secure location. Draymond is on the phone with one of his colleagues who is reporting in. There are no bodies at Medina University, no Professor Young, and no identical-looking men, despite Draymond's confidence that he did shoot 3 or 4 of them, like he knows that he hit them. As he turns to look at Tiffany, he sees the shocked look on her face. A TV in the room has an image of what I'm assuming is Tiffany and Curtis kissing, and she is shocked that Alva could get this. How could he get this? Draymond then reports to her what I already reported to y'all. They need to move her, but she cuts him off. No. She knows why he wants to move her, but he needs to hear her out first. We then cut back to Curtis. But let's stop a minute before we keep charging through this narrative. First off, the visual storytelling in this issue is really taking some hits. Dennis Cowan and Bill Sienkiewicz continue to be paired up as the art team, and they do make a good pair. But during the scene with Baraki and Tiffany, there's a very basic art error. There are 2 main artistic differences between the portrayals of the women, their skin tone and their hairstyle. Baraki's so far has been colored with a darker skin tone most of the time, while Tiffany has always been portrayed as just a little bit lighter. Also, Baraki has long, flowing hair, and Tiffany has a pixie cut. But when Baraki and Tiffany are in the hallway, both of the women have long hair. And that wouldn't be a bad thing, except that Cowan tends to draw people materializing from out of nowhere in this comic. Either they appear to phase in like Sim's bodyguards did in issue 4, or they just enter from off-panel like the Multiple Man guy. We never get a solid establishing shot of who he's supposed to be. We just get glimpses and snippets. So this second long-haired woman in the hallway could be a new character entering the scene. Quite frankly, that happening is just as likely, if anything it's more likely, than it being an artistic error up at this point, which makes that scene really confusing. Second, after Baraki sets the code to lock the door behind Tiffany and her bodyguard, we still see Tiffany in that scene, looking at Baraki. But she should be behind a locked door, running for her life. So is she standing behind the door, and Cowan and Sienkiewicz just didn't draw the door in order to make sure that she was clearly visible watching Baraki face this man down? I don't know. It is super frustrating, and it's really confusing, and it makes the scene very hard to read. The same is actually true for how Asher and Hardware escaped their situation. I did my best to read between the lines and give y'all some kind of plausible explanation for what happened, but there is not one provided in the comic itself. Asher dives into the water and he does something, and the floor collapses. That's really all that we're shown, and we aren't told anything greater than that. That moment that Thomas cut us away to Tiffany to hide his dramatic plan really should have just been used to tell us what that plan is. That way, if the artwork fails to convey that plan properly, at least I know intellectually what was going on here. Why did Asher plug into Hardware's backpack? I don't know. Why did he suddenly have a power tool / blaster / gun? I don't know. What did these things have to do with creating a hole in the floor? I have no idea. And I'm really frustrated by it. This should be a dramatic, tension-filled moment. This should be something that gets our blood pumping, and instead I'm left here going, what just happened? That said, I do like Baraki's willingness to stay behind and save Tiffany, even if I'm not sure how effective a move that's going to be. Both women are loves of Curtis, and either one of them would make an ample hostage against him. Sure, Tiffany is the one who was mistreated by Alva and the police earlier in the series, but she was also being publicly represented by Professor Baraki. So with her gone, does Tiffany have any kind of legal leg to stand on? Who in the world is going to listen to her now? We can see her already being smeared by the media, referenced in that TV screen of her kissing Curtis, so does anyone believe her at this point? Again, it's very hard to tell. The multiple-man bad guy that we're facing here, who we'll later learn is named Reprise, almost manages to come off as creepy. In 80% of his scenes, we don't even get to see him. We just hear him talking off-panel with repeating word balloons. Initially, this is a bit annoying to read, as it's just the same dialogue copied and pasted over and over and over. But in reality, if this was happening to you in that moment, it would be like hearing a crowd coming for you from all directions. You can't escape it. It's just a tide of humanity. And at this point, we don't know for sure what that looks like. But there is that 20% of the scenes in this comic where we do get to see him, and he looks like an absolute flooping doofus. His costume is bright yellow and green, his sunglasses are obnoxious, and even his hairstyle screams that this is a guy who likes having attention on him. But then the creative team casts him as this secret assassin hiding in the shadows, doing dirty work for corporate overlords. It feels super conflicting, the needs of him in the story versus the way that he was designed, and I kind of hate it. There is something to be said for the metaphor of Reprise. He is, as Baraki pointed out, a dangerous white man whose superpower is that he makes dangerous white men. There is nothing special in that idea to Baraki's eyes. That's just life for her. And I think that there's some commentary going on here about how one white person's voice can be weaponized against black people, as if it carries all the weight of white society. One white woman accuses a black kid of being rude, and white society murders that kid. It happened to Emmett Till. Someone called the cops on George Floyd, and he was choked to death. Alva calls Reprise to kill Tiffany. This is a fictionalized version of real-world events, but that's ultimately what all comic books are. Even Reprise's name has a little bit more meaning to it. A reprise is a repeated passage in a song. We see this literally in the fact that he copies himself, and again in his dialogue, which is often just repeated. But that means that one man's voice is creating an echo chamber, where his opinion is the only one that matters. He doesn't need to listen to anyone else. He doesn't need to argue with anyone else. He has himself, and he's the majority, thanks to his powers. And that's all that matters. Reprise is an interesting concept that I kind of adore, but he's delivered in a package that I think really fails to connect. The character intellectually is frightening and powerful and dangerous, and I think that stuff works, but as a silly-looking comic book character, it takes a lot of the weight away from what he's supposed to stand for. The Asher and Curtis scene is played fairly straight. Now that Asher knows he can't be a bystander in this private war, and he's already paid for his role in it, he decides to ally with Curtis. He doesn't do it because it's the right thing to do, mind you, but because what else does he have left? Nothing but revenge, executed through Curtis. For his part, I like that Curtis sees the shared emotional weaknesses between the three men. They all use people. Alva used Asher and Curtis to make a fortune, Curtis used Asher to upgrade his suit and keep him safe, and Asher is now willing to use Curtis in order to get his revenge. These are all brilliant men, but they are also all self-interested and manipulative. I especially love that Curtis doesn't see this in just Asher or Alva, but himself as well. It makes sense that he would develop that way, given that he grew up with those two men. It is one of his greatest character flaws, but if he is aware of it, then Curtis can begin to work on it and hopefully grow out of that behavior. So after all of that stuff, we find Curtis on Asher's plane. He has de-helmeted and he is panting. An updated version of Pop, who sounds much more human than in the previous issues, is worried about Curtis's vital signs. He drops to his knees in shock, and Pops assures them that he's got control of the plane. Curtis has been running for weeks on nothing but fumes, and he needs to rest. It's just you and me here, Pop says. Take a minute. As Curtis slips to sleep, he asks Pop to say what his dad used to say when he went to bed. Pop doesn't respond. Oh, right. Curtis hadn't programmed that much yet. It's okay. He remembers. We then see Curtis's father wish him a good night, and they go through their nightly routine when he was a child. Hours later, Baraki Young is brought to the office of Edwin Alva. She is openly hostile towards him, not that she attacks him or anything. She's just very curt, very rude. Alva says that he should have expected her to take his side, meaning Curtis. Baraki states that she actually warned Curtis about him. She saw through Alva's veneer years ago, but Curtis didn't want to. He loved you like a father, you know. Alva counters that he loves him like a son. He didn't want any of this. None of it's his fault. And Baraki can't tell if he's serious or if he's joking, and... oh. No, he's serious, isn't he? Alva honestly doesn't believe that he has done anything wrong here. If you loved him, then you'd have given him what he asked for, she says. What he earned. A percentage, a small pittance of what this company makes off of Curtis's mind, Baraki argues back. You would have given your son what he deserved if you loved him. Deserved? Alva replies. What do any of us deserve? His phone chirps. The plane carrying Curtis has touched down. Infrared shows one person is still aboard. How should they proceed? Alva looks at his guest. Do you think that Curtis deserves a chance to end this peacefully? Baraki smiles. You're the one who lured him back here. You get what you get. He studies her for a second, and then tells his agent that the suit Curtis is wearing belongs to him. He wants it back. Copy that. The agents prepare to move in, and the plane explodes. Hardware rockets out, streaming through the skies of Dakota. As he does so, Alva explains to Baraki that there is a larger lesson at work here than just catching Curtis. The problem here, you see, is that Curtis thinks that just because he made a thing, that he owns the thing. But what really matters isn't who made it. It's who provided the spark, the inspiration, the resources. That suit of Curtis's, that hardware, only exists because of Alva. Curtis would never have made it without him, and as such, it belongs to him. Without Alva, Curtis has nothing. He is nothing. Eventually, he'll come to realize that, Alva says. For example, those buildings that Curtis is flying by, they may not have Alva's name on them, but he was the one that proved that Dakota was a city worth investing in. Those businesses that followed him here, that built those buildings, they were inspired by him, and so those buildings are his. A signal jammer is being broadcasted from those buildings, and it disrupts Hardware's suit as he enters their field. His AI systems crash, and Curtis starts to fall from the air. He shouts for Pop to reboot the system, but the AI is down. Curtis punches his own palm, attempting to manually reboot the suit himself, but it doesn't start the process until he is just seconds off of the ground. Curtis slams into the pavement. Thankfully, his inertia dampeners absorb most of the impact, but they can't handle all of it. As Curtis pushes himself to his knees, blood runs out of his mouth. Pop, don't leave me, he says through bruised ribs. Dad, I need you. Watching this from Alva's office, Baraki pleads with Curtis to get up. A dozen drones hover into position above Curtis and begin to fire lasers at him. Hardware takes to the air again and uses his plasma omni-cannon to destroy the drones. One of them manages to blast Hardware in the back, knocking him back down to street level. Reprise, standing on the sidelines and smiling, greets Hardware. "Hey man, I got a message for you from Alva." Curtis pulls out a double-ended hook from his arsenal. "Alva could tell him himself in a minute." He's going to have to go through Reprise, though, if he wants Alva. And here the man activates his powers. Nearly 24 copies of Reprise fill the street, surrounding Hardware. Reprise flexes. He's going to have to go through all of him. Hardware braces himself from the fight. Yeah, bet. So we've now had Alva's big villainous perspective pitch. Anything and everything that he can lay claim to, he does. If it's good, it's something that he has ownership of. And if it's bad, well, then it's the fault of somebody else, isn't it? Someone like Asher Sim or Curtis Metcalf. Notably, characters who are both minorities. But there's a real-world complication to Alva's idea of ownership, and that is that ownership in America is generally settled legally. We can tell who owns what because there's generally legal documentation following that ownership. And sure, Alva has a buttload of money and influence, and I honestly do believe that he could buy whatever he wanted to. He can probably manipulate contracts and win legal battles and basically just steal ownership of whatever he wants. The idea that he legally owns the hardware suit? Sure, that's a thing. I think it would be hard to prove in court, but I can see that fight happening. But that particular threat feels so unimportant to Curtis being allegedly responsible for the Big Bang. The driving force behind Curtis being on the run isn't him stealing corporate property, it's the Big Bang. It's mutating and potentially killing teenagers in the streets. Who cares about what Alva owns? We have the idea that Alva owns the buildings surrounding his company because he's the one who inspired them to be built, and that sounds like the ramblings of a madman. But then, those buildings literally do emit a signal that jams Curtis's systems. So, did Alva go to that building, tell the person who owns it that he actually metaphorically owns it, and by the way, he's installing some piece of tech to disable his rogue protege? For real? I'm supposed to believe that? If that's the case, why not show us that? I would have loved to have seen Alva shout down some neighbor just because he has money, so shut the floop up and do what I tell you. The more Alva could have demonstrated his unhingedness, the more that I want to see him take him down, right? When he's threatening more people than just Curtis, there's more of a desire for justice from me. And secondarily, how did Alva even know what frequency Curtis was using in order to jam it? Can you just, jam every signal inside of a closed system? The tech here is so vaguely described. Oh, why not? My God. After Curtis is attacked by the police earlier in the system, Thomas could have had Alva offer Tiffany Curtis's job. And she would have been reluctant to do it because she didn't trust Alva anyways, but she says yes because it's more money and it's more power and it's more influence, and this is what she was training for anyway. She was Curtis's protege, right? She does this so that at first we just think she's turned on Curtis, she's a jerk, but no. She's actually trying to help him. She's tasked with salvaging what she can from his lab. She finds blueprints for the hardware suit and then starts to build her own, but she is found out by Alva, who uses the blueprints to build counter technologies, and holy crap, he could have put Reprise in a rip-off suit. But that would have been before the around-the-world upgrades that Curtis did, so Curtis then has to outfight his own designs, beat Reprise's superpowers, and he would have proven that his own designs are superior to Alva's, and then he could do it without Alva's tech as a base to build off of. Holy sh... No swearing. That would have been tight. Our final issue of this series does not pick up where you would expect it, with the cliffhanger that we left off on. Instead, we actually pick up on Tiffany's story. She and Draymond, and hey, fun fact, it actually isn't Draymond here. You remember the cool bodyguard who died back in issue 5? That is the dude who is with Tiffany here, so we've got another art error happening. Anyway, they're at Curtis's childhood home. As Tiffany breaks them in, Draymond is watching the news on his phone. Asher Sim has begun releasing documents that accuse Edwin Alva of fraud, insider trading, and more and worse. There's also something called the System, but like it's an acronym. We have an editorial box here encouraging us to check out Icon and Rocket issue 6, so stick that in your back pocket for when we get there. Tiffany opens up a door inside the house, and she steps into a workroom. I would assume this is a garage because it kind of looks like a garage-like space, but we're not given enough of an establishing shot to actually prove that. Tools line the wall. A sketch of Hardware's helmet is pinned up as well. It sounds like Asher is helping Curtis, and they're going to as well. I'm not sure what is at the core of the problems with this scene, but it has a whole bunch of them. Issues beyond the resurrection of Cool Bodyguard, who happens to steal Draymond's name, either. When we arrive at the scene, Draymond is commenting on the news, which he is watching on his phone. The dialogue between Draymond and Tiffany goes back and forth, and so Tiffany is shown saying, "Watch my back," while she picks the lock of the front door. Draymond then says, "What's going on?" And Draymond then answers his own question, replying about Asher Sim dropping the incriminating documents. Is this an issue with bad writing, failing to identify what is going on and who is saying what? Or is this an artistic issue where Cowan failed to properly convert the script to image? Or is this a lettering issue where they just put the wrong word bubble pointing to the wrong person? I don't know, but it's confusing as hell. Having accomplished that, we now cut to Curtis, who is fighting a crowd of reprise. As they fight, there is a power level reading being presented to the audience, and Hardware's power is dropping quickly. As the pair fight, Reprise passes on his message from Alva, alluded to at the end of last issue. That message is pretty simple, that if he keeps fighting this, Curtis can and will go right back to where Alva found him. Just another poor black kid with nothing to his name. Just apologize for making all of this trouble, and Reprise won't have to stop him. Curtis laughs this off. He isn't here to stop him. He's here to wear Curtis down. Curtis then tells Pop to do a full spectrum scan, and then they start brawling again. While they do that, Baraki, still inside of Alva's office, fakes a heart attack. Alva calls in some support. He can't have Curtis showing up and she's already dead. But, of course, Baraki is faking. She lets one of the men get close enough to examine her, and then she slips her hand into his shirt, grabbing his pistol. She shoots the people who came to help her and turns the pistol on Alva. "You want a bullet?" she asks. It is probably faster than whatever Curtis has in mind. Alva just stares her down, and she leaves. Curtis, meanwhile, finally figures out a way to identify the original Reprise. Each time that he makes a copy, that copy has a little bit less mass than the original. He finally spots the one that is a bit heavier and tears into him. Hardware downs him with a plasma punch to the face and a double-edged hook to the leg. Doing so also takes every ounce of energy from his suit. Without the hydraulics it provides, it immediately becomes too heavy. He needs to shed the weight. Meanwhile, Draymond drives a van into the front of the Alva building. He and Tiffany, I'm sorry, it cracks me up because it's such a action movie thing in such a late end part of the movie, and it's so disconnected. This smash cut feels like it really comes from nowhere. But he and Tiffany, wearing her own stripped down version of the Hardware armor, leap out of the van and then open fire. Tiffany makes sure to warn Dre not to kill any of the guards. They aren't evil after all, they're just dudes doing their job. They find Baraki holed up, which is perfect timing because Curtis also walks into the building. The outer layers of his armor have been discarded. He's down to his all-black underarmor, his gauntlets, and his hook weapon. Baraki tries to get him to stop. Asher is dumping all of this info. They've got Alva cornered. He doesn't need to do this anymore. But Curtis won't be swayed. It doesn't matter what Asher does. It doesn't matter what any of them have done. He shouldn't have gotten any of them involved, and he is going to be the one who ends this. When Curtis arrives at Alva's office, the older man has a pistol drawn and held on him. Alva is impressed. Not many men survive an encounter with Reprise. If he knew that Curtis had that in him, he might have believed that he really could have trusted him. Then he shoots Curtis in the chest. The armor manages to take the bullet, but the impact still staggers Curtis. Was it all a lie? Curtis asks. Was he only really here to be a scapegoat? Oh, Curtis. I loved you like a son, Alva replies. I still do. He shoots Curtis again, this time square between the eyes. But Curtis fights back onto his feet. Fall, damn you, fall! Alva fires again, hitting Curtis in the shoulder, but the younger man charges forward. He chucks his hook weapon, slicing into Alva's arm. He then grabs him by the collar and throws both of their weapons out of a nearby window. Curtis! The old man shouts, perhaps pleading. No, Curtis growls. Hardware. Bright lights wash over the room as a police helicopter swoops in. Nobody move! We then jump 2 weeks into the future, after that scene is wrapped up. Edwin Alva has been arrested and is still being investigated thanks to the evidence presented by Asher Sim. Metcalf, meanwhile, has dropped off the map, although social media rumors say that he is staying at a private facility outside of Dakota, paid for by Asher Sim himself. Wherever he's been in the meantime, we see Curtis visit the home of Deacon, the child who was wounded during a fight back in issue 2. He meets Deacon's mother, Sharia, who is a bit skeptical about him and his interest. But he did make sure that Deacon got help, and he assures her that nothing like that is going to happen again. Deacon's dad shakes Curtis's hand, and he takes him to a nearby playground. We see Deacon sporting a broken arm, but it is in a cast and a sling. He's eagerly talking to his two friends, and Deacon is just relieved. The kid almost dies, and somehow he turns it into the best thing that's ever happened to him. He looks at Curtis. You sure you don't want to meet him? Nah, Curtis says. He just wanted to make sure that the little man was all right. He's planning on starting some more trouble soon, so the less people involved with him, the better. As they chat, a sonic boom draws both of their attentions skyward. Curtis pulls off his glasses. What the hell? Deacon's dad shrugs. What? I thought all you super people knew each other. That's Icon, man. Seems a real shame that kids are growing up in a world where their heroes aren't human, doesn't it? Curtis stares at Icon. Yeah, it does. That's an interesting setup. Hardware versus Icon. I mean, that's basically Iron Man versus Superman. But as cool as that is, that's not why we're here. Not yet, anyway. We've closed out Curtis's story for now. So how did it do? It did okay. I think Curtis himself is a very interesting character. I like Curtis's need for approval, stemming from his father leaving and his continued search for a father figure. When Alva couldn't be one, Curtis then literally made a new father figure, the Pop AI. We see him ask Pop to say the same thing as his biological father did before bedtime as well. So how far can this AI father-son relationship go? I don't know, but I do think that it could be pretty interesting to see. I also like his complicated relationship with the other people in the story, as demonstrated by his friendships and alliances with characters like Asher Sim, Tiffany Evans, and Baraki Young. Curtis appears to have a gift for manipulating people, much like Alva does, into doing what he needs them to do. But I do think that it's more of an unconscious thing with Curtis. Because while Curtis does choose to show up at Baraki's and Sim's locations, and thus drags them into his story, he doesn't actually ask them for help. His plan isn't to recruit them into his anti-Alva army, it's to just use them for a time. When they do offer to help, he also turns them down, right down to his final confrontation with Alva. Strangely enough, despite Curtis having a support team and even a superhero protege in Tiffany by the end of this comic, as a character, he stands alone. To that end, there is no mention of Baraki or Tiffany's fate at the end of this comic. Tiffany showing up in her own hardware armor isn't addressed by anybody in the story at all. And it's one thing to have Iron Man show up and be like, whoa, it's Iron Man! It's another thing for someone to show up in their homemade Iron Man cosplay and be like, hey! Who cares? The attempt on Tiffany's life is not mentioned in the news. Whether or not Tiffany and Curtis are still in a relationship isn't spoken about. Asher's character doesn't get a real sense of closure either. Despite how Curtis's story affected them, this is ultimately Curtis's story. And so they are left behind by the time this book closes out. Which is a real shame to me, because author Brandon Thomas does a lot of work to establish Baraki and Tiffany as their own characters. Yes, they might be a part of Curtis's story, but he isn't the focus of their efforts. Baraki fearlessly risks her career to publicize Tiffany's story, and Tiffany risks her life by speaking out about Alva and then armoring up herself. They are both smart, courageous, beautiful women, and I would argue that either one of them would make a compelling lead character in their own right, but they aren't the lead character here. They are bit characters in Curtis's story, and so their stories don't get any kind of ending or closure here, and that is something that I find incredibly frustrating. Either they're a part of Curtis's story and their journey should reflect his, or they are on their own journey and they should be given their own sense of closure and ending. Giving them their own sense of agency outside of Curtis's mission ultimately leaves them feeling detached from the overall narrative. Their efforts in the end, as much as I may have enjoyed them, did nothing to stop Alva. Tiffany's story in the news did not spur an investigation into him. Baraki's kidnapping didn't make the news. When Tiffany shows up in her own armor, sure, she saves Baraki, which is a great moment, proving her Curtis's equal in the story. But then Curtis walks right in the door behind her without his own armor on. And then he confronts Alva alone, and the story ends. The final confrontation also leaves me feeling a bit unsatisfied. Curtis visited Alva once before when in his armor, back at the end of issue 1. He didn't kill Alva then. That was never the mission. He wanted to expose Alva, to tear down his world, to break him. But none of Curtis's intentional actions in this comic do that. He travels the globe, he updates his armor, he returns, and he does the exact same thing that he did in the first issue. Curtis isn't the one who brought Alva down by the end of the story. Asher Sim did. And it would be one thing if we had an end scene where Curtis revealed that he visited Sim in order to set up his betrayal of Alva, or if Curtis visited Sim and asked him for dirty information that he was reluctant to turn over until it was just too late. Sim providing all of that intel wasn't even a part of Curtis's plan. It was luck. Given how much of this book is structured around Curtis being a genius in his own right, that feels like a really ungenius story moment. Especially since conceptually, Curtis asking for help would be the thematic opposite of Alva's character. Where Alva manipulates and steals from others in order to make himself look good, Curtis's story could have been about him asking for help and sacrificing his good name in order to publicize other people's stories. Then, when their stories cause an investigation into Alva's business practices, that is what would ultimately clear Curtis's name and restore him in good standing. Because don't think that I did not notice that Curtis did not get his name cleared by the end of this. Alva is being investigated for a variety of crimes, sure, but there was nothing in this book absolving Curtis of his alleged role in the Big Bang. So why are the police off of his back? Why isn't he still being investigated? Keep in mind that while, yes, he was defending himself from police being manipulated by Alva, Curtis also killed a bunch of people in this story. The cops that were at his lab when it blew up, the helicopter pilots who were chasing him, the men who were on the plane, the men who were going to get him on the plane when he detonated it, the guards who were in the elevator when he went up to Alva's office, who we are shown face down on the floor of the elevator laying in pools of their own blood. An argument could be made that Curtis was acting in self-defense, I suppose, but it is still murder. And given how easily Dakota appeared to believe the lies about Curtis, I find it hard to believe that they would just forget that all of that happened. Where is something like the Dakota police chief being forced to step down? Where's the scene of Curtis being cleared of all charges? I don't care about Deacon. Where's my flooping closure? And what's the deal with Alva calling Curtis his son and then shooting him in the face? Are we meant to take this as Alva being so greedy and bloodthirsty that he would just kill his own son if it gained him something? I mean, I guess so. It's the only thing I can come up with for why. I also think that there's a missed opportunity for Reprise to be better worked into the narrative, too. We're told that Alva is connected to the military-industrial complex, and that he has done work for them before. We also know that he owns a gas that gives people superpowers, right? So why not have Reprise spying on Curtis from the start? And then, when Curtis is traveling the globe, Reprise has copies of himself all over the globe, tracking his movements. Him hunting Curtis is what could have forced him to go to Asher, even though he didn't want to risk endangering him. The attack on Asher's place could have been carried out by Reprise, bringing home the idea and threat that Alva's reach is everywhere and is endless. Maybe at this point Curtis even struggles to fight Reprise until Asher releases documents containing how his powers work. Then he could have defeated... Oh, no! He'd learned how to defeat Reprise, but his original body would be back in Dakota. So Curtis would then contact Tiffany and ask her to stop him. Once Reprise was defeated, then Curtis could have returned to Dakota and confronted Alva in the courtroom. He could have had Asher send Baraki the documents, which her contacts would have vetted, combined with Tiffany and Curtis's testimony, and a federal investigator could have taken up their side and charged Alva. He would have had his company's assets stripped away, Curtis's technology would have been awarded to him, and then he would go off to start his own company. That ties so much of the narrative together in a way that feels very much more satisfying, right? Am I crazy? There is a lot of good here. Clearly, I'm having some fun spitballing story ideas and iterating on what already exists, so I do think there is a good story to be had. But author Thomas presents us with a disjointed narrative that presents us with what we want to see, sure, but he doesn't actually deliver on what the story is about. The social justice issues are very real, and I do think that they're handled well, and I like Curtis and his surrounding cast at the end of the day. Thomas just needs to refine his storytelling a little bit for me. Despite a handful of art problems, I do enjoy the artwork here. Cowan and Sienkiewicz's line work is scratchy and very kinetic. When care is taken in depicting someone's face, they are detailed and realistic. They look good. The coloring is great, the characters look good, save for Reprise, who looks like a doofy 90s cartoon villain, and I did enjoy reading this comic. Much like Liefeld's run on Captain America from the Heroes Reborn episodes, if you think about this too much, if you don't think about this book too much, then it works well. Only when you start to kick at the tires do you see that we're missing a couple pieces. Next week, as much as I don't like interrupting a streak of episodes, I am going to. I wanted to do something different for Halloween this year because in the last 2 years, Breakdown pretty much didn't acknowledge its existence at all. but I like Halloween and I think that it's fun. So next week, you get to experience an original breakdown scary story. I am super nervous about sharing this with you all, as it has been ages since I wrote a piece of original fiction, but if there is any time to do something that scares you, I would say it has to be Halloween, right? The week after next, we will be starting Icon and Rocket so that we can finish out this set of Milestone episodes. I haven't decided if that book is going to be a static style one-shot or a multi-part series like Hardware has been yet. I've honestly been so focused on getting this original story written and having it be something that I think is worthwhile that I haven't honestly even looked at Icon and Rocket. They're sitting on my desk, but I haven't even flipped through the issues yet. So join me in a week for Comic Book Breakdown episode 23, our first Halloween Spectacular. Comic collector James has discovered a new unknown comic series, and he sets out to finish the collection. But just how far will he go to do it? And what will it ultimately cost him? Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.